Hi, I'm Phil Badley from Diamond 9.
And I'm Lucy Trueman, Managing Director from Trueman Change.
Lucy, it's great to be talking to you today. I know we're going to talk about a piece of research that you've done recently on lessons from lockdown. Let's do change differently. Just start by telling us a little bit about what got you into the idea of producing your white paper.
So we do change management. We help organisations to make change happen and do change well. And like many small businesses, lockdown was a period of us a bit of time to reflect. And also, just personally speaking, when COVID hit, unfortunately, we lost my dad. So I took a little bit of time away from the business and really wanted, I suppose it almost started off as a bit of therapy, really, to look for some positive at a time when it really felt like the world was shifting at such a rapid rate. And we have predominantly worked with the public sector in the past, and when I was looking around, and as I came out of my own sort of bereavement, looking around at other organisations that I knew and that I'd worked with that had historically perhaps found it difficult to make change happen quickly, had suddenly been in a position to react and make change happen pretty much overnight. And I found that quite an interesting concept. And the other part of it that was interesting was that although the problem and the crisis was new, the solutions that many organisations were putting into place were not. So people were talking about things like getting staff to work from home, better partnership arrangements, better links with their communities, and all those things had been talked about historically. So all of a sudden, this crisis hit. It hit everybody in some way. Some people were very personally affected, some people were affected through their job, but it hit everybody, and I think that was quite unique about it. And then organisations in the public sector had to pivot immediately to respond and to create a proper response to this crisis, and had to do it very, very quickly. So that really was a bit of food for thought for me of how has that happened and how have we made that happen. And some of that was very much kind of old school change management around burning platforms, and some of it was perhaps new ways of working. But it started really from a desire to just talk to people and understand, and then it built on from there. So once we spoke to a few people, then we thought maybe we should hold these as sessions and other people can join in, and maybe we should pull all this together in a paper. So it evolved very naturally, really.
Sounds very interesting. What kind of interest did it generate?
And so once we started, so I started by just speaking to people who I knew and being like, wow, this must have been a really intense time for you. Tell me how you did it and what happened. So it started off in our own network. But once we got the idea of let's actually hold some conversations and we put them out, so I reached out on LinkedIn and on Twitter, lots of people came forward saying, I'd like to be part of this. And we had huge diversity in terms of backgrounds and roles. So we had chief execs, we had psychologists, we had directors, we had politicians, we had a real mixture of people from a real mixture of organisations. So my personal background is very much in local government, but we've spoken to people from hospitals, from universities, from private sector. So it did generate quite a lot of interest from quite a wide variety of people. And I think what I took from that was that the experience of COVID was, although affected us all in different ways, it did affect us all. And also the experience of change is a human experience. It's not necessarily related to specific sectors. And it was quite nice to see all the common things, so whether you run a factory or whether you run a hospital or whether you run a council, all of a sudden we had to say, right, bare minimum people coming into the office. And that experience and the response to that was pretty universal across lots of different organisations, which was nice to see.
So it's one thing to generate the webinars or to generate the interest, to get people to want to talk about it on your webinars. What gave you the idea then to produce a white paper?
So we themed the webinars, and we themed them based on what I thought people would want to talk about. And so the first few themes were one around rallying up with the community because of my local government background, one around remote working, one around leadership, one around culture change. So we did theme them specifically. But what we found was once we'd run 2 or 3, I found that we were having quite similar and linked, connected conversations. So there were certain themes like changing how we communicate with staff, like creating a culture where there's a permission to fail, that whatever the theme we were supposed to talk about was, we were coming back to those kind of overarching things, which made me think there are some common lessons running all the way through these. And the easiest way to do that really was to pull out what we thought those key lessons were and put it in a white paper as a chance to share that learning. But also that's now fed into the next round of what we call change chats that we're running in autumn, where we're going to explore some of those lessons in a bit more detail. So it just seemed an easy way to draw out the themes, rather than people necessarily might not want to listen back to 5 different chats.
And that makes a lot of sense. And having read the paper, I can take certainly from some learning from having read that paper. And within it, as you say, you identify seven lessons about doing change differently. And what I thought might be useful is to just talk through those 7 lessons. So lesson 1, you talk about passion and purpose to drive change. So tell us what you learned about purpose and passion.
So I think we tend to work with quite big organisations, and the thing with quite big organisations is they often have quite a big remit, and particularly in the public sector and particularly in local government where I work, the sheer amount of different tasks that they do means that they're very big, sprawly organisations, where you'll be employing people to empty bins, you'll be employing lawyers, teachers, massive range of activity happens in these sorts of organisations. What COVID did was it created a very specific purpose. So for some organisations it was get all the staff home. For universities it was get the students home and change the way we teach. For some organisations like local government it was make sure that the people who are shielding and can't get out can get fed. So there was this immediate, very clear purpose. And what's funny is that's not a lesson for change. That's something that we all know, but something that we somehow never quite managed to pull off. And I think that the combination of that crisis, of that very clear thing that we have to get done, that helped to drive it forward. But what it also did, which was really heartwarming, was it reignited that passion in people. So I had somebody who actually said to me during one of the chats, I've been working in local government for 30 years and I'm finally doing the thing that I came to do, which is help people. So it really drew out of people this, we've all got to pull together, we've all got to make this happen, and we've all got to, in effect, save lives. It was that serious. And I think that was the massive difference that COVID made, was that clarity and that passion and that, real single focus of getting something done. So how do we recreate that without the crisis, I think, is the challenge for change managers going forward, because I don't believe it's healthy to be in that crisis mode psychologically for a long time. But I think the lesson for managing change going forward is make sure you're very, very clear with your people. This is precisely what we need to change and why.
So that's really interesting, Lucy, isn't it? That somebody had been in local government for 30 years and yet found themselves frustrated and unable to take action, which is fascinating, because that also is your lesson too, taking action. So what did you learn about organisations' capabilities to move at speed?
So I think that they surprised themselves is the honest answer. And I think that it probably links very much with what I said about lesson 1, which is that having that absolute clear purpose. But there was just a culture of, we just need to figure out what we need to get done now. And I think previously it's been quite common in change management. And I don't think we need to not be a pendulum where it's one or the other. We do need both. Mm-hmm. But people's comfort zone is very often that high level, strategic, setting a roadmap for the future, doing a big plan. And in some ways that it's important to be thoughtful about change, but it is also important to take action. And this swung that pendulum to completely the opposite, that we didn't have time. Nobody had time to do a plan. Nobody had time to do a roadmap. It was just, actually, we need to feed. I mean, one person described how he literally just took a car full of people to Costco and spent hundreds of pounds on food to deliver to local residents on his own personal credit card that day, without thinking, what process do I need to follow here? So there was something about creating that permission to fail, that everybody in it together, we just need to figure out what we've got to do today, chunk by chunk. I think that's how they managed to take action so quickly.
Let's hope we can take that lesson and learn to take action rather than to procrastinate, which is something we're all guilty of from time to time. That takes us on to lesson 3, and there's a lot of talk, has been for many, many years in the sector, about the importance of partnerships, and I know that's your lesson 3. So partnership working in all sectors is really important and has varying degrees of success these days. But what did your research throw up about the conditions for effective partnership working in this type of environment?
So one of my favourite quotes through the whole process came from a chief exec of a leisure service, and that was, we need to make connections, not contracts. And I think where a lot of partnerships run into difficulties or stagnate is because people start off from the position of, well, what's the budget, who's paying for what's the structure? It's always the back office conversations, and that was completely turned on its head. And it was, right, we've got to deliver this, we're going to need help, who can help us deliver this? So the conversations around partnership were very much focused on what difference are we making to our communities, instead of what's the structure and the back office of it. And that enabled it to happen. The other thing I think that was interesting about partnerships was that some of the organisations that did particularly well did acknowledge that they had good partnership arrangements beforehand. And I guess my personal prediction is we're moving forward in all sectors where we're going to have a really hard 2 or 3 years at least. And I think organisations will be forced to come together and work together more in perhaps more creative ways than they would have done previously. So that groundwork of developing good relationships with your partners outside of there being a crisis, that paid dividends massively to those who did it.
That makes a lot of sense. And I know that kind of lesson 4 is be aware of emotions, and there's an interesting link for me with partnerships, because often in partnership working there can be a huge amount of misunderstanding and frustration with one another. Given the scale of change that was happening in people's lives, I can imagine that controlling or managing emotion became a really important part of this learning process. So what can you tell us about how to be aware of emotions?
So I think for me, this conversation around emotions was sort of 2 sides of the same coin. So on the one hand, there was a lot of conversation about being aware of others' emotions. And again, back to what I said about COVID affecting everybody in lots of different ways. It was a hugely emotive issue. So if you have been a manager or a leader during the last 6 months, you will have been managing people who were frightened, who were worried, who were upset. They might be bereaved. It might be that their job is secure, but somebody else in their household has lost their job. So it's something that has affected all of us at a very deep emotional level. So there's a skill to working with people through those emotions remotely, which is very different way from what we're traditionally used to. But the other side of that coin was actually about being aware of your own emotions. And I think a huge part of resilience is giving yourself a little bit of space and time to feel what emotions you're going through, because this has affected everybody. And in some ways, the fact that it's affected everybody did reduce some of those barriers between sort of managers and staff. But there was something about being able to be aware of how you're feeling and being aware of how other people are feeling, which I think was massively heightened during COVID, but is still a lesson that we know that it is normal for people to go through a range of sometimes negative emotions when they're going through some sort of change and something is out of their control. And perhaps if we were as aware of that and as kind as people were during COVID, during a normal business change environment, that's something that I really hope people take forward.
It's interesting, isn't it, how we tend to notice the behaviour in others, but we don't necessarily think about our own behaviour and the impact that our behaviour can have on others, particularly in a leadership setting where you are you're very much setting the context in which others are allowed to work. I must admit, your next lesson made me smile, as also somebody who historically has had a background in public sector. This is the whole notion of reducing bureaucracy, and I know there's been lots and lots of attempts at that over the years. But in terms of there being too many rules and too many processes within organisations, you've already alluded to the person that went to Costco with their own credit card to sort a problem out. What else did your webinars throw up in terms of how to reduce bureaucracy to make change happen?
So what I found interesting my work is project management, and project management is a discipline that is famously drowning in paperwork. And there's lots of very strongly held opinions about how to administer a project. What was interesting was that the organisation that did well managed to cut huge amounts of bureaucracy, but they didn't necessarily cut sort of connections and meetings. So something that people often say is there's too many meetings, I'm always in meetings. Actually, those that did well had daily meetings, really short daily meetings of what are our priorities today. But what they didn't necessarily do was have extensive strategy documents and plans and minutes, and all of that paperwork side didn't really happen. Now, I think again, and I do feel like a stuck record saying this, because it's something that I think about often, is we need to not be in that pendulum. So we need to not go from having loads of paperwork and drowning in it to then having none, because there is some risk. And most organisations, whether public or private, do have to be accountable for the decisions that they've made. So there is a happy medium. But I do think it has allowed organisations to free up their thinking and concentrate on what do we need to do to get this done, rather than let's just follow the processes we always follow. And so again, that's something I really, really hope organisations take forward. And certainly from my perspective at Trueman Change, I try and instill in my team, we're there to deliver change, not administer it. And you need to do the right level of administration to make sure that you're recording things and you're thinking things through, and you've got a bit of scrutiny there. But your core job is to make it happen, not record it.
That makes a lot of sense. I love your lesson 6 too. Be human, not hierarchical, which almost seems impossible in most large organisations. Sounds like an interesting lesson. What did you find helped here?
So I think this probably linked really closely with the emotional intelligence lesson. What happened was people just were forced into situations where they had to get stuff done, and things like job titles became less and less important. And actually the fact again that this was a crisis that affected everybody almost leveled the playing field a little bit. So I think that those that just opened their heart up to, right, we've got to roll our sleeves up and get stuff done, their people around them did the same. They were the ones that had the most success in terms of making it happen quickly. And again, it probably links with that shared purpose. The other interesting thing that I do think has been unique about the last 6 months is this way of working that we're doing now. You're in your home and I'm in my home. My cats are actually behaving at the moment, but almost every call I've done has had a kitten walk across the screen. And I've worked with people, I don't have children, but a lot of people I work with do, so there's kids in the background. And there is something about, almost, even though nobody's seen each other face to face, inviting into our homes, that is stripping away some of that professional mask that some leaders rely on. Some leaders want to have that mask of authority and job title, and all of that's been stripped away. Now, I've never been into that way of leading, so that suited me just fine. I'm quite happy sat here with no makeup on, chatting to people in my own living room. It's not for everybody. I think some people found that difficult, but I do think it did strip away some of that hierarchy and made people connect as humans, which I think is a really positive thing.
I couldn't agree more there. I think the challenge potentially for organisations thinking about this is that it's a one size doesn't fit all, isn't it? In the sense that there's a degree of isolation in remote working. family setting, as you've said, is really important. I've been doing some work with somebody who's been homeschooling. So along with the doorbell ringing for parcel deliveries and kittens and cats walking in, other animals, children coming in to have the homework marked, it kind of sets a real life context, doesn't it? But it also shows the complication, the complicated lives in which we live and we work. And when you actually bring the work into the home setting, it almost adds a different level of complexity to how you work and the emotional resilience that you need to be able to perform well in all roles that we occupy within our lives.
Definitely. And it is worth saying that although generally the change chats were very positive about that issue and most people did really embrace that, there are some specific examples and some specific professions where it's really not very practical. So when I spoke to people that worked in social care, they were saying, for example, to be asking a lot of, in social care, it's quite a high proportion of newly qualified social workers, so they're already not a huge amount of experience, to then put on them that they're having to deal with emotionally incredibly challenging work to do with children and families where in the same setting where their children are. There is sometimes for some types of work a real benefit to having a clear barrier. And so I think that, again, let's not swing completely one way or the other, but I do think it's enabled us to have those sorts of conversations in a much more meaningful way, whereas previously the conversation would have been, well, you come to the office unless there's a very specific reason to work from home. I feel like we've opened up something about, you know, being much more human about it, talking about work-life balance. And there are some other risks that were discussed. You know, there's a risk that the culture of presenteeism, of sitting in an office, has now been replaced by the culture of presenteeism, sitting in front of your screen. So some leaders that we spoke to talked about, you know, going for a run and making a quick video while they were out to really model and lead by example that this is about work-life integration, and it shouldn't be that it's opposing forces. And so still loads and loads to learn there, I think. But for me personally, somebody that's never been good at being professional, I think it's great to let people into my home and be myself and to let go of that mask. I think it's really lovely.
Yeah, and that brings us to lesson 7, and I'll kind of start my own little introduction to lesson 7 by saying that, having read the document, there's a wonderful quote in there from Liz Hardwick from DigiEnable about the idea of people spending on average, was it 36 days a year on emails, and there's a real risk, isn't there, in the setting that we're in, and the dislocation in the way that we're working, that getting the balance of communication right becomes really important. So communicate is your lesson 7. Tell us a little bit more about that in the context of change, Lucy.
So, I mean, this is a lesson I've probably been harping on about for years, and I think that COVID almost amplified the importance. But if we know that when people go through change, they will go through a range of emotions, and if we know that, and we know that communication and support and actual meaningful engagement on a two-way basis can help people to work through those emotions, it's a complete no-brainer to say that during a time of uncertainty and a time of change, you need to double, triple the amount of times you're communicating with staff. And the other thing I really love about communication is when you look at professions where it is crucial to the success. So if you look at marketing people and politicians whose entire success rate is based on whether they can win over hearts and minds, they take a much more methodical and systematic view of communication than the average leader or manager in a business context does. And I think some of that's a power balance, because, you know, we think that our staff should just listen to us, so we only have to say something once. It's known in politics that you have to say, it's only when you're bored of saying it that it's sinking in. It's known in marketing, there's lots of statistics around how people have to consume a certain amount of content. It has to be across, I think, 4 different channels. It has to be at different points in time. And yet we don't seem to transfer that lesson through to when we communicate about change. What happened with COVID was, because we took away the office, people had to very quickly adapt to that and replace it. And the natural thing to do to replace it was communicate lots and often and in different ways, which is exactly what people in that profession would tell us to do. So I think by accident, it's amplified those lessons about how important. And then you add to that that it was a universally accepted emotional impact that everybody knew they had to deal with. I think it was just the perfect way to shine a light on something that really we should have already known.
I can empathise with that. So the 7 lessons from your research, Lucy, what would you suggest that leaders need to pay particular attention to in the future coming months to bring about the kind of change that's required?
So I think probably lesson 1 was the most powerful, but the most difficult to replicate, which is that create that passion and that purpose and that clarity. That's where I see most change programs wobbling, is that, you know, we come up with visions and statements that are really just catch-all things that you could never disagree with, but they're not 100% clear. So I think that's probably the most powerful way. Decide on your change and make it happen. But I also think the stuff around emotions, that will continue, I think, for some time. And I think we're nowhere near really understanding the emotional impact of COVID. I think that will come out in the months and years to come. But I think that awareness of emotion, that acceptance that that's normal, and then looking at how you can manage around that and how you can support people, I think is crucial. And we don't know the changes yet. That's the other thing. You know, the first bit of make sure everybody can work from home was probably the easiest. You know, I speak to people in children's social care that are preparing themselves for demand doubling once kids go back to school, because schools are a big referral. You know, we speak to businesses whose demand for specific things have gone through the roof, but other things have dropped off. You know, it's very, very difficult to predict at the moment what changes any organisation will need to go through. So there's something about being agile and being ready for that and being open to that I think are going to be a challenge going forward.
Thanks, Lucy. So tell us, how do we get hold of the white paper?
The white paper's on our website, which is truemanchange.co.uk. If you go onto our homepage, I think something does flash up to invite you to download it. But if not, there's a section on our page, which at the top of the menus is resources. On the resources page, there's lots of videos we've done, and there's a direct link there to download the white paper as well. And also just to say it isn't a finished product. You know, we're doing some more conversations between now and Christmas, where we're going to talk about things like communication. Again, we're going to revisit the speed, and we're going to talk about the people impact. So there's lots more chats, and we'd love people to take part in those chats. And we'd love people, you know, if you want to talk about or reflect about how you've managed to make change happen or what your challenges are, then we'd love you to get in touch, because I think the more people we speak to, the richer this piece of work will be.
Fantastic. And you talked earlier on in this piece about a future series of webinars that you are under development at the moment. What's next up for you on that?
So the next one is on the 4th of September, which is communication. So we've got at that session 3 or 4 communication specialists. So one's a PR specialist, one's a communications interim manager who moves around, and then 2 people that are based within specific organisations, talking about how they kind of worked with what they needed to do differently as a result of COVID, and both internally and externally. And I think certainly the ones from local government, that's very interesting. I live in Blackburn, and we're going to be speaking to somebody from Blackburn Council. Blackburn have struggled really, in that they've had to have higher restrictions than other parts of the country. And at the moment, there's a bit of a split in the borough. So some it's quite high, and others of the restrictions have reduced. So the external messaging around all that at the current point in time has been a real challenge. But also internally, you know, how have people kept in touch with their staff, and how have they made it happen? And so that's the next one. And then the one after that is people impact, which will be very much around leaders and that emotional impact, which I think is really crucial.
That's great. And presumably we can find out more again from visiting your website? Yeah,
we have an events page on our website. So again, at the menu bar, and so if you just click on events, then all of the future events that we've got are on there and ready to book onto. They're all free, they're all online events, and they're all sort of 60 to 90 minutes on a Friday morning. And so please do join us if you can.
Well, thanks, Lucy. It's been really interesting talking to you about lessons from lockdown let's do change differently. It's great that you've shared your findings with us on this. I was going to say this webinar, but it's a video, and it could also be a podcast. So, thanks for watching, and also thanks for listening.
Thank you.